Hello all, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome back to Let's DevOps. In today's video, we are going to talk about some of the best practices that could be followed on Git or version control repository. This is not a topic that has been largely touched upon. Sometimes it's been taken for granted, but there are some good practices that could be adopted while a project is starting on Greenfield on any of the version control tools, GitHub or GitLab or Azure DevOps or Azure Repos or any of the version control tools. So without much delay, let's get started. All right. So before getting into the actual demonstration, I would want to quickly run through the best practices that we are going to see in this video as a quick gist before we actually start. So we are going to see the following best practices in the video that is going to follow. We are going to see the recommended repo naming syntax, the logical commit message best practice that one can follow. The README file is a must, and that is one of the other best practices that we think needs to be incorporated. A simplistic, minimalistic branching strategy. Uh, we are going to actually see a branching strategy in itself in the demo to follow to see what a minimalistic, simple branching strategy could look like. Some of the mandatory policies that must be put in place, like the branch protection rules, the pull request merge only for the protected branches, having tags recorded. Uh, if you're finding some of the terms hard to understand, just don't worry. This is what the video is about, and we are going to explain each of this best practice in a detailed way going forward. Apart from these best practices, there are some additional good practices that one can follow, like having a Git hook in place or Git hooks in place. Uh, in fact, we are planning to have a dedicated video for Git hooks in itself as a separate topic, so watch out for that. Uh, Communicate well with the fellow developers to avoid merge conflicts. Merge conflict can be um, stopped or avoided if there is better communication. But even if, despite of it, you do face merge conflicts, then please don't worry. There is a way to, or there are a couple of ways to rectify or resolve these merge conflicts. And one of the best practice ways to resolve the merge conflicts using Git rebase method, which is covered in one of our previous videos. So please go out to the channel and check out. Uh, you will find this video. And other good practices, never ever code directly on the UI, even if it's a small change, one line change, never do it directly on the UI. Always use a coding IDE like an Eclipse, IntelliJ, or Visual Studio Code, whichever comforts you. And follow some IDE good practices as well, like having a code linting tool integrated, having security tools integrated. Again, these are vast topics which we will cover in separate videos going forward, so watch out. Let's start first with the naming convention. All of these best practices that I'm going to talk about in today's video are not hard rules as such, but it's just based on my experience and my uh, uh, things that I follow in my day-to-day work. But there are different ways people can do it differently. This is just purely my uh, opinion. All right, uh, let's start with the naming convention. So it's better if we keep the repo name short, simple, and entirely in lowercase, because you don't want uppercase, lowercase, mix and match, and it's pretty hard to maintain a standard naming syntax when the organization has tens of hundreds of repositories. So keep it short, simple, and in lowercase. Secondly, you could use hyphen or an underscore in between individual words. I would even go ahead with the recommendation of having minus over underscore because it's simple to use than using underscore. Uh, so that's one best practice to start with the naming convention of a repository. Next, it's always good to have a README file. Now, when you initiate a repository or create a new repository on Git, every repository while creating would ask you for this option. Maybe let's give it a try. So if I go here and then on the repositories, if we try to create a new one, it will test repo. Oops, new. A good description is also a good idea to add some logical description of what this repository is. Some logical description. Place. And you see here, add a README file. It is always good to have a README file associated while creating a repository because it gives you a gist of what this repository is all about. What kind of an application is it? A front end, back end service, or a microservice, or whatever? People can identify the information of what this repository holds using this README file. Uh, and let's just go ahead and create, which means while the repository is created, it will come with a README file, and then it's just that you need to put in some text about this repository and what this repository about. Right, let's go back to our repository. Yep, that's the second thing. Third thing would be uh, Git commits. So let's say uh, you are updating the files or modifying the files. I mean, you would definitely not use the UI for it, but you would be definitely using some kind of an IDE or a client to work on editing these files. But once you update them, it is always recommended to add some logical commit message followed by git Jira ID. Now let's say I add this and I want to commit, and in the commit message I add this. Let's say your Jira ID is looking something like this maybe. So some logical message, comma, and then the Jira ID, and then a commit message. So basically, many of you would know that there is a very seamless integration between the version control tool and Jira, which can be established, which means that once you do that integration, the moment you pass a Jira ID in the commit message, on the Jira, you can see that there is a link to this commit, what change has been done to what file. There would be a development pane on the Jira which will give you this information, and that is mainly why we want to add this Jira ID into the commit message along with some logical uh, commit message. So that's a very good practice to follow, that there is a proper commit message in place followed by a Jira ID. Uh, there is one additional thing that we could say that uh, to enforce this, what if there could be a question that what if people miss this out or miss to add a Jira ID in place? In that cases, there is something called as Git hooks. Um, but we are not going to jump into the details of Git hooks, but that is also definitely a very good practice to have in place, is to have an established Git hooks of some of the must in place rules that we need to set while committing or pushing messages, the files to GitHub. For example, in this case, it's the Jira ID that we are talking about. So we can have a Git hook in place that will always look for a Jira ID in the commit message. If there is no Jira ID, then your Git hooks will break. Uh, in this session, we are not getting into the details of the Git hooks, but uh, we will definitely, as a follow-up, I'll definitely do one video which will exclusively talk about Git hooks and what is Git hooks capable of. Right, so that's also one other best practice that could be followed. Now let's come to some of the policies that in my opinion that needs to be in place uh, when you are setting up a new repository. Even before going in there, let's quickly also talk about branching strategy. Now, when the moment we are talking about Git, we also want a very good branching strategy in place. I mean, it need not be very complex. It could be a very simple, robust branching strategy for any projects that is starting on greenfield. I will give an example of what a simplistic, minimalistic branching strategy could be, but then again, we will do another detailed session on some of the different branching strategies I've implemented in my experience so far. So let's look in here. One of the simplistic branching strategies could be is to have a main or a master where your latest production deployed source code is sitting, and then from the main you branch out two branches, develop and release. uh, Maybe it's a little tricky to understand here, so let's go to a diagram. Again, it's not one of the greatest arc diagrams, but I just pulled up something quickly uh, for understanding purpose. It's very simple, so please bear with me. So we have main, where your latest deployed production deployed source code would be sitting, and from the main you create two branches. One is called as develop, the other one is called as release. Develop, as the name suggests, any kind of development that happens to your application needs to get merged to this develop branch, and after the point where it's ready to get deployed or production released or QA release, then the source code from the develop branch needs to get merged to release branch, and then the pipeline that is looking into the release branch gets kickstarted. So let's just quickly walk through this. Main, and from the main you have two branches branching out, develop and release. From the develop, any kind of development needs to happen from here. So which means, let's say there is a feature development happening and there is a bug fix development happening, then the developers will have to branch out from the development branch, develop branch. So they create, you can see here, feature slash UI customization is branched out from develop. And then another developer is also working on some kind of a bug fix. He also creates his branch from develop, and then they work on a couple of versions, they commit their code changes, and then once they are ready, they have tested it out on their local environment, they create a pull request back and then merge it back to develop. Same with the, maybe this is not right, there should be another version, because the moment this developer commits, there is a new version created, and when the next developer wants to commit, he will have version 4. Okay, not bad. Right, then once the code change is looking good enough to be merged for a release, then there'll be a pull request created on whichever version you want from the develop branch into the release branch. Again, in terms of CI/CD context, there will be a CI/CD pipeline that is looking into develop branch. There will be a CI/CD pipeline that will keep looking into release branch. The moment there is a code change or a successful pull request merged into develop, the CI/CD pipeline on the develop branch will get kickstarted with all of the unit tests and regression tests from the develop branch. And then the other CI/CD pipeline on the release branch, there the moment there is a merge that happens on the release branch, this one will get kickstarted where it will basically go and start deploying the application, the tested application into each of the environments, QA, dev, QA, pre-prod, and prod, and so on. So this is uh, one example of a very simplistic, minimalistic branching strategy that could be in place, and that's basically what we have it in here. Uh, there's another best practice that needs to be followed to try and have not a complex branching strategy, but a minimalistic, simplistic one. Next, let's get into some of the policies that could be kept in place. Nothing here. Right. So first, we'll start with the branches. As I said, we have something called as branch protection rules. So it is a must thing that needs to be followed in every organization. You need to protect all of the important branches. Now, in this case, we talk about three important branches: main, develop, release. Even if one of it is deleted by mistake, then we are dead in the water. We are losing a lot of code changes, a lot of money, cost, time, and so on. So we need to protect all of these three branches. How do you protect them? You just add the branch protection rule. You say which branch you want to protect, and then you say you want a pull request for sure before you merging into this branch. Basically, this means that you cannot directly do any code changes to the develop branch. The changes that are coming into develop branch should only be via pull request, and that's how you are kind of putting the gates for someone who can just directly clone the develop branch and then do some code changes and push changes in. No, that's not possible. You have to create a feature branch or a bug fix branch or some kind of a branch from the develop branch, do your code changes there, and then only merge changes to this develop branch or the release branch via a pull request. So you check that box and you specify how many reviewers you want to have to do something called as a code review. Uh, so you provide your code reviewers, and I mean, there are a lot of options. I would just keep at least this basic stuff and put it in place, which means you can see now your main and your develop is protected. It says not enforced because I've kept this repository as a private one, and private repositories cannot be branch protected. In this version, you have to go for an enterprise version. But if it is a public repository, it will work. So you can ignore that. Perfect. Now let's look into tags. Again, tags is something that is good to add. So once you, where do you generally add tags? When there is a release version ready. Let's say on the develop branch, you reach a milestone where you have some code that is ready to be released. Then you create a tag and then tag that piece of code which is ready for release. A feature that can be used, it's good to be used, not again hard rule as such. Otherwise, I mean, every version control tool has its own features, but in my opinion, these are at least the basics that needs to be incorporated into any new repository or anyone who is starting to work on the version control tool, uh, so that it makes his life easy while working with more and more repositories in future. Thanks for listening in to me. That's pretty much it for this session. Meet you all in another session. Thanks. Bye bye.